Ever felt like your darkest fears of being watched were actually true? Well, this powerful documentation pulls back the curtain on life as a targeted individual, where privacy becomes fiction and safety an illusion. This series stands as both documentation and resistance, a refusal to be silenced despite overwhelming odds.
Hello, welcome to the Dire-Rie of a Sane Black Woman. I am your host, Marie. This is where I speak from the intersections of faith, technology, surveillance, and survival. This docuseries is where I name what's been done in the dark and reclaim what's been stolen in silence. Look, I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here simply to testify / document my experiences as a targeted individual, because what I've experienced can't be explained away by glitches or paranoia. It's deeper than that. It's layered and it's real. As the former CIO of the White House, Teresa Payton, said during an interview on Scammers Payback, it's only paranoia if it's not true. So on today's episode, I will go in and discuss digital injustice, but not just the kind that lives in the headlines or research papers. I'm talking about the kind that shows up in your uploads, your inbox, your neighborhood, or your spirit. And I'm not making absolute claims here. I'm naming patterns. I'm basically sharing what I've observed, what I've endured, and what I continue to resist. Because when you're targeted, the attack doesn't stay in one lane. It spreads. It spreads into your personal life, your professional space, your spiritual walk, and it doesn't always come through the front door. Sometimes it's spyware, sometimes it's a neighbor on a balcony, sometimes it's a bot that follows you just to watch, not support. So let's look at the algorithmic mirror. They say that algorithms reflect us, right? But what if the reflection is warped? What if the mirror is being manipulated by unseen hands, malicious networks, or scripts running in the background? Here's what I've seen. Podcast episodes that stall. The inability to upload or get flagged before I even publish something, depending on the platform, right? Thankfully, I've managed to challenge these and have worked around these obstructions, although the bad actors and malicious codes continue to attempt to obstruct the progress of the destined state. Now, metrics don't match the feedback I've received. Followers who feel like plants, watching, not engaging, but maybe even reporting, right? And so a feed that's full of creators who either seem to have read or heard content, but it's not reflected in the analytics or stats, but those who seem to have been commissioned also to troll, perpetrate false claims, narratives, and make snark comments relating to recent posts or just overall character assassination and or whatnot, right? And so you also have people physically lurking, whether it's on balconies, parking lots, listening in, not to support, but to intercept, to be nosy. And I can say right now, I hear an echo as I'm recording this, and I don't know if it's just the structure of where I am that has an echo, or if it's something, a device that's been planted and that's recording me that's causing the echo. Now, also, since I've started this podcast, I've been, wondering if there's possible content that leaks before I even share it publicly, right? Because I am constantly being monitored. My networks have been infiltrated. My devices have been infiltrated, and people are constantly trying to record, monitor me through various means. There's also been patterns of technological interference that align too precisely with moments of breakthrough or truth telling, right? Even if I'm using or trying to upload something, if I'm using AI and I'm doing research on a particular topic, whether it's to troubleshoot or to prepare for my podcast as I do research on, what's been happening, right? Not only to me, but potentially to others. And if there is a pattern of this occurrence. You also have loops of data or moments, right? Whether it's a snapshot in time, doxed info, private data leaks, recycled to paint a false picture, or just basically to amplify what's negative, right? And so they don't want to look at the entire person or individual. They magnify a moment in time, something that has happened, and try to basically paint that as the entire individual. And so even without tech, right, in hand, I've noticed that I've been monitored. And whether I've walked into hotel lobbies and watched cameras grab my face, seconds later, the front desk phone rings or a text goes out to the host. And I've seen it happen in stores or on sidewalks in places where I should be not necessarily anonymous, where basically I should feel free. I know that there's cameras everywhere, but I believe most people, when they go out, they don't get like a trigger, like something is not triggered or an email is not sent, a text message is not sent when they appear somewhere. But that happens to me. Like if I walk out my house to throw out the garbage, there's a trigger. Something is triggered electronically. Someone receives a message and, people react to that. And so because someone or something is watching, right? Digitally, there's been scripts that's been written to basically trigger these things. So it's a combination of not just the digital, but also the physical. And so it's not just algorithmically, but also environmentally, right? So because these people, they have been programmed, they have been programmed to watch me, they have been brainwashed to watch me, and so they are now part of that network, right? Not only their phones and their devices are part of this bot network, but they have also subscribed to the network because now they're devoted and they're committed to monitor me, to spread information, to, dilute or, the truth, and basically to harm me in every aspect. And so this is what happens when technology is used not to serve, but to surveil. And, it's not used to connect, but to control. And so what are the real world repercussions when you have all of this going on, right? When the algorithm is poison, it doesn't just affect what people see, it actually affects what you can do, right? And in my situation, I've experienced this firsthand, whether it's online purchases that mysteriously fail or get flagged, right? For example, Best Buy. You know how many times I've tried to purchase certain things on Best Buy where the purchase would go through and then like minutes later it would be canceled, right? And I have a subscription with them. And regardless of that fact, I've actually had to go into the store to purchase like a Geek Squad membership. And even after physically walking in with my credit card and making that purchase, and they know that I have a subscription, if I try to make a purchase today, it gets flagged. And so there's a lot of things that's basically embedded and maliciously scripted basically to prevent me from doing certain things, especially as it relates to tech support or tech devices and things of that nature. You have instances where accounts will lock or have glitches while right after I speak, the truth, or right after I use a keyword, that might hint that I'm either, whether it's I'm praying or I am trying to research, things that might help me digitally, right? Things that might help me suppress the digital surveillance, things that might help me to remove malware, things of that nature. Videos that have vanished and things of that nature because of corruption on my devices, so tampering with evidence, things that have sites that have malfunctioned, right? I've had sites, especially from my ISP, where certain tabs, like I wasn't able, like for weeks, I haven't been able to access the internet tab, right? Why can't I access it? So I had to actually try to find a workaround to access the internet tab, or certain buttons, right, that don't function, like you can't actually click on it. And, I've experienced that on multiple websites. So these are all things that have happened because of digital corruption and things that have been used to attack me. So first digitally, and then obviously you have, I would say, symptoms from the digital attack, right? And some of those symptoms include job opportunities that disappear without explanation, right? Whether it's due to reputational damage, things that they have painted, things that they have received, through planted data. And so you have reputational damage from half-truths, loops, and manipulated metadata. And the people who receive the distorted info act on it, right? And so this actually ends up blocking, reporting, or spreading lies. So that is what's occurring, ladies and gentlemen. And so even from a spiritual standpoint, so I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, where spiritual spaces, whether it's virtually or in person, have become infiltrated, whether it's YouTube, spiritual space, a Zoom spiritual space, an in-person spiritual space, where these networks, whether it's a digital network via devices or people actually following you into those spaces, and where they're basically trying to spread lies, spread misinformation, spread private information as well, right? So it's a mixture. And so oftentimes people just accept everything that they see as truth, and they don't look at it from an objective standpoint. And so discernment is clouded. It becomes clouded by the digital distortion. When we're looking at this distortion, how can it actually negatively impact you, right? It's not just, data that's being spread and sent, but it's actually it's rooted in a lot. It's a lot deeper. And so, these aren't just technical flaws, they're lived consequences, right? And when they're aimed at someone like me, someone who speaks my truth, someone who speaks the truth, someone who disrupts silence and refuses to conform, they become tools of suppression. And let's look at some stats here. So facial recognition systems misidentify darker skinned women up to 34.7% of the time, compared to just 0.8% for lighter skinned men. This is from MIT Media Lab and Buolamwini and Jabru from 2018. This is just regular stats, right? This is not even stats based on malicious actors interfering. This is just based on, the technology and how it was programmed, right? Whether that was conscious or unconscious bias, this is basically the end result of it. And additionally, African American and Asian faces are 10 to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white male faces. This is from NIST 2019. And then poisoning, just 0.001% of training data can cause AI models to spread misinformation or behave maliciously. And this is happening more and more. I recently watched a video that Judge Faith, she posted a video about how misinformation about her and her husband getting a divorce was spreading. And, it started with one blog and then other people took it and it was just spreading like crazy. And then it basically it started to become like in actual search results as fact. And so, all it takes is just a small misinformation or a small data point being spread, basically to poison and affect, someone's reputation, livelihood, and so forth. I'm happy in her scenario, she was actually able not only to identify the people behind the malicious data that was being spread, she was actually able to get recourse. And, that is very encouraging. However, I mean, not everyone has the means that, she has basically to basically get to the root cause of what was happening. And in her case, people were actually publicizing information openly about her. In my case, it's being done more covertly, so I think it's a little harder to identify. But the stats about the 0.001% data poisoning comes from Cornell University, and it was published in 2020. Now, predictive policing tools have wrongly flagged individuals based on biased data, leading to false arrests and reputational harm. And this is from ProPublica and PredPol investigation. And that's not just predictive policing tools, but also even like with social media. I know when I first launched my YouTube page and Instagram, it was flagged immediately because of, the corruption that was happening behind it. And, once they looked at it, immediately it was basically, they saw that it was a mistake, right? And so that's how these things can basically trigger and affect you, negatively. But this is not just one-sided, right? It's not just about the programming. It's a trifecta. So it's bias in design, it's bias in data, it's bias in deployment, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And so when a malicious actor enters the equation, it's not just bias anymore, it's weaponized distortion. Let me break it down for y'all. AI, right? When we talk about bias in programming, AI reflects its creators, right? If the original training data or design choices are skewed, whether consciously or unconsciously, the output will mirror that bias. For example, I spoke about facial recognition earlier, in this segment. And so facial recognition systems trained mostly on lighter skin faces misidentify darker skin individuals up to 100 times more often, right? And then so language models trained on internet data absorb toxic stereotypes, then reproduce them as neutral output. And so those are two examples of bias programming. Then you have malicious actors amplifying the bias, right? So now imagine someone with ill intent, not just negligence, injecting adversarial prompts, right? They're injecting adversarial prompts, poison data sets, or surveillance triggers that's biased, and so now you have these adversarial networks that can subtly manipulate AI, basically to ignore certain voices, flag benign content, or prioritize harmful narratives. And I've experienced this in every aspect of my life, and so there's coordinated suppression, right? So it's within the technology, but it's also now embedded in the bot networks, but also the actual human networks that are willfully, participating. So the coordinated suppression can look like the algorithmic coincidence, but it's actually engineered silence, right? Especially when targeting either prophetic or restorative voices. So multiplication now happens through in the infrastructure as a result of that. So once the bias is embedded, once the bias is embedded, either through the programming, right, the initial programming, whether it was bias or intentional bias or unintentional bias, as well as the malicious actors that are now also injecting, poison data or malicious data into the system, now this begins to spread across platforms, right? Social media, search, cloud tools, text messages, search results, right? Across the devices, phones, routers, power lines, across perceptions, how others see you, how you see yourself. So it's viral, right? It's viral, it's global. Technology is basically, there is no barrier to technology, right? It's not in one location. It's not confined to one location. So it spreads, and it spreads rapidly, right? Especially if it's gossip, especially if it's malicious gossip, especially if it's salacious, it will spread. This is why I believe it's so important for me to document what's happening to me, documenting and diagnosing the obstruction that I am experiencing real time, as well as reclaiming my voice and narrative. I believe it's vital to do that. And I'm not just resisting the bias, I'm disrupting it. I'm disrupting the entire feedback loop that multiplies it as much as I can, right? Because there's been a lot of obstruction. There's a saying, where there's movement, there's friction. There's been a lot of friction. There's been a lot of attempts to obstruct the progress of the destined state. But, I will continue to push through. So let's look at bias multiplied, right? So when AI becomes the weapon, they say numbers don't lie, right? But what happens when the systems counting those numbers are trained to ignore you? What happens when the algorithm isn't just flawed, but weaponized? Let's talk about the stats a little further, right? We looked at some stats in the prior segment. Let's look a little deeper. So let's look at then versus now, right? The stats they gave us versus the truth emerging, right? In 2020, they said that AI was the future. Global IT spending hovered around $3.9 trillion. Bias was framed as a glitch, a bug to be patched. Now, in 2025, global IT spending is projected to hit $5.6 trillion, and AI is the centerpiece. The AI market alone is worth $500+ billion, and that's expected to triple by 2031. Okay? But here's the kicker. 36% of companies admit that AI bias has already harmed their business, and 62% lost revenue, 61% lost customers, And that's just what they're willing to admit, right? I can admit as an entrepreneur, as a small business person, as a professional, I've been impacted. My business has been impacted. My mentorship opportunities have been impacted. A lot of different things have been impacted. Career opportunities have been impacted. And so, yes, I can attest to that. Now, bias isn't a bug, right? It's a blueprint, right? Let's just call it what it is. It's not a bug, it's not a glitch, it's a blueprint, right? It's the programmer. If the programmer was biased, the output will be biased as well. Now, let's add, the malicious actor into the mix, or a network determined to destroy you, and that malicious output is multiplied several times over, right? And we've seen that. We see that in the experiences that I've been basically documenting and sharing with you all. And I'm sure, the people that have lost revenue, the 62% businesses that have lost revenue or customers, they've seen that as well. And so I believe that those who are already disenfranchised or marginalized typically get the brunt of it, unfortunately. So imagine having pre-existing obstacles based on your color, your ethnicity, your sex, your religious beliefs, and then that negatively being amplified even higher or to the highest degree by the way that technology was programmed, and then also by malicious actors. The technology and the malicious actors essentially set you up for failure, whether that's what was intentionally or, unintentionally, by the programmers, whether that was done intentionally or unintentionally by the programmers, and or how the malicious actors or networks have exploited what they were able to exploit, right? And so let's call it what it is. Let's call it what it is. It's engineered erasure. It's engineered erasure. So let's look at some more stats here. GPT-2 reduces Black specific words by 45.3% and female specific words by 43.4% in content filtering tests. In hiring tools, resumes with Black male names are systematically filtered out. And in long documents, large language models are trained to ignore critical information, especially if it's buried, nuanced, or inconvenient. This isn't just about fairness. It's about who gets seen, who gets silenced, and who gets erased, right? As I mentioned, it's engineered erasure. That's essentially what it is. So let's look even deeper. Let's look at the feedback loop of suppression. Bias in, bias out, right? I mentioned it before, garbage in, garbage out. But when you add malicious intent, it becomes a feedback loop of suppression. So you have adversarial actors that can train AI to ignore, to flag, to shadow ban, whoever is basically speaking out. You have an infrastructure level manipulation from power lines to platforms. They amplify and the distortion, and then you have the result. Ontological bias. AI doesn't just reflect the world, it reshapes what we're allowed to imagine. And, a lot of people, they just, whatever they get and see, that's what they take as truth, and they don't even second guess it. And so, prophetic disruption, reclaiming the narrative. This is why, I speak. This is why I document. This is why I refuse to be edited out of my own story, because, everyone else is trying to tell my story. Everyone thinks they know me. Everyone thinks they know me better than I know myself, better than those who are close to me know me. So it's pretty interesting. So, every time I think it's important, to speak out, because every time we name a pattern, we break its power. Every time we speak the truth, we rewire the algorithm, right? Hopefully, every time we show up unfiltered, unbothered, we reclaim the mic. And so let's look at where prejudice hides, right? Again, garbage in, garbage out is the saying, but what if garbage was planted, right? What if the algorithmic feed, or the algorithm was fed poison data intentionally, right? That's where you have the malicious actors. That's why, I'm constantly seeing all these obscene things in my feed, even though I'm not even touching this stuff, or things that I haven't even looked up in like ages, or things that I'm not even involved in that I'm seeing. But, this stuff is intentionally being planted. And so someone who knew that they knew exactly what they were doing, it was intentional. And so like I've seen how, one person tuned into a malicious network can basically trigger a chain reaction, right? And that's why now, like, I have a botnet of people and devices that are essentially attacking me. So they feed the system false flags, right? As they're receiving data, they're feeding it more data. They're distorting the data. They're distorting the narrative. And so you now have distorted metadata, and you have manipulated scripts. I'm talking about text scripts, such as, whether it's Python scripts or whatever scripts that they're using, manipulated code, and things of that nature. You have the algorithm now that's absorbing this stuff, and it treats it as truth, and people treat it as truth. People make decisions based on that. Companies make decisions based on that, and this now begins, they begin to respond accordingly. Right? Platforms start to flag content. They slow uploads. Things freeze up. Important decisions are made based on these, things that have been fed into the system. And so, even like online purchases, right? As I mentioned, they get disrupted, they'll get canceled, pages won't load, so many different things, right? Recommendations turn hostile, or recommendations are obscene, so people, so now you have people who receive this poison data, as I mentioned, whether biased or not, they begin to act on it, right? They begin to act on it, some consciously, some unconsciously. They take whatever they see firsthand as truth. They make decisions, life altering decisions, on this, right? So, this is now blocking, whether a system is blocking you, whether a platform is blocking you, or it's reporting you, or it's ignoring you, or it's not loading, whether it's a DDoS attack, or just different things that are happening, behind the scenes, technologically, or people reacting on it, this is what's happening. Or even worse, right? Some people are joining in. They're joining the bot network. They're joining the gang stalkers. And so now it's not just the algorithm, it's a ripple effect. It's a ripple effect. And I've spoken 2 episodes ago, I've spoken about the ripple effect. And how that can, the ripple of silence and the ripple of harm. Go back and watch it. So once a malicious seed is planted, it can grow into a forest of obstruction. And the worst part is that it's hard to prove, because the system is designed to look neutral, right? And so it's designed to hide its hand. And so, people will say it's a glitch, it's a coincidence. or worse, that it's not happening, or that you're paranoid or delusional, or that you're even insane, you're not in your right mind, you're unstable, whatever, whatever it is that they'll say basically just to make you seem like you're lying or what's happening is actually not happening. So, and this is all happening while they're trying to destroy your life and while they're trying to reroute your destiny. But, the devil is a liar, and so is his mother-in-law. Whatever the enemy meant for bad, God will turn into good. And so when we look at all this, I want to kind of break this all down, right? I've said a lot. I've shared some stats and, I've shared some examples of what I've experienced, although I haven't gone into I haven't done like a deep dive, but, high level examples of what I've experienced, with just bias programming as well as malicious, data poisoning and algorithmic poisoning. But let's look at it, from structural standpoint and how does that actually feed into the system. And for those who are listening, you probably, you can't see this, but I do have a diagram up just basically to help you visualize what I'm talking about and how this actually happens. So if you're listening on a podcast platform that's just audio, check out the YouTube version, for the visual. I'm also on Rumble, so, you can check that out as well. The videos, I usually post the visuals to YouTube first. So, check out YouTube. But if we look at the first segment or the first part, right, which is core bias and malicious injections, which speaks about, the core bias, which is the programmers, right? So as they're programming certain technologies, they're training it, but the data is biased, right? Whether it's conscious or unconscious. So you have the bias data, the training data, and then you now have, because someone hates you, someone's jealous of you, someone you offended knowingly or unknowingly, and is now maliciously injecting, malicious data into the system. And then now you have algorithmic poisoning. And so that is the input, right? That is the input, garbage in, garbage out. So now what do you have? You have bias programming and malicious actors. Now, the second part of this is the algorithmic and platform manipulation, right? So that includes search engine distortion, keyword triggers, ad targeting bias, if then protocols, that are manipulated. For example, let's say I'm searching for targeted individual or cyber stalking, I'll probably see cyberpunk or scammer or, whatever, right? My search results are basically being manipulated, but also, different things on my feed are also being manipulated as a result. And so the bias training data, the malicious actor injection yields bias programming and malicious actors, which then yields to algorithmic poisoning. Now, the third piece of this puzzle or diagram is your environmental and surveillance tactics, right? So I mentioned before that in addition to all of these devices and things that they have, you have facial recognition alerts, right? I can literally go outside with no technology. We know that there are cameras everywhere. Wherever you go, there are cameras, right? If you go to the store, if you go outside, if I'm in a hotel lobby, there are cameras there. So even without any devices, or even if my devices are shielded and turned off, you have these facial recognition alerts. And then you have spyware and device hijacking, right? So that will trigger an alert to, maybe someone that's close by, they'll get a message, they'll get triggered. I mentioned this before. The tactic is to offend or alarm, and then basically, try to manipulate that person basically to now target me as the targeted individual. And so their system will also be hijacked, even if they're not aware of that. Now their system has spyware on it, and their devices now become hijacked. And then you also have the public space monitoring and loot metadata, right? So the hotel lobby is the perfect example of that. And so, that's key. I just want to kind of pause here for a little bit. That's the key thing. A lot of people who are involved in this bot network, they don't realize that their system is also hijacked. They don't realize that they also have spyware. They don't realize that the network as a whole is hijacked because the only way that, or the only reason why you got the message was because the system, the network has information about you. They know what your triggers are. They know what's going to offend you. So then they send these, things, these messages to you. And then now they program you mentally to basically become part of their force, their malicious workforce, their malicious bot network, right? And this now triggers or spills over into now your personal, professional, and spiritual network, right? So what does that look like? That looks like reputational distortion, purchase interference, as I mentioned before, platform suppression, and spiritual infiltration. So this basically invades every aspect of your life. So that bias programming and the malicious actors basically will now trigger by the bias training data, right? You have the bias programming and the malicious actors via the malicious actor injection and the bias training data, which then leads to algorithmic poisoning and ad targeting distortion, and also malicious profiling or just, incorrect profiling, if you will. So what does the full system reveal? So the full system, the full picture basically shows you how this all comes together, right? So let's look at it. So here we have bias programming plus malicious actors, right, will cause personal reputation, distortion, stigmas, rejection, exclusion, just harm, right? Reputational harm. Then you have the bias programming and the malicious actors will, through public spaces, the user patterns will now trigger statements that will launch more harassment, right? These statements will launch more harassment. And then now you also have social media. There are, things spread so quickly on social media. So now things are being spread via social media before spyware, adware, malware, information leaks, manipulated data leaks and things of that nature. And then also, obviously, your platform, whether it's actually shadow banned or blocked or obstructed, things of that nature, and interference. And then you also have the spiritual aspect I mentioned, which is like spiritual infiltration, things of that nature. I have the last episode, season 2, episode 4, where I talk about on during the second half of the episode, I talk about how technology can be used for spiritual warfare, right? When we talk about monitoring spirits, we no longer need to talk about monitoring spirits from a spiritual standpoint because these individuals, they have technology to monitor you. They no longer need to seek spiritual means to know what you're doing to try to obstruct your progress or to try to obstruct your purpose. And from the bias programming and the malicious actors, you have, online purchases or just basically online activities being obstructed, manipulated. And so, valid transactions being canceled, not being able to use a platform to, the way that it was intended to be used because certain things are malfunctioning. You have ad targeting distortion that are quote unquote personalized ads, messaging and products based off of bias and malicious data. You also have another output is from the bias programming and the malicious actors, you have predictive algorithm interference, which includes AI making outcomes based on the malicious data, right? AI basically. So then it's just basically, again, a feedback loop. It's a cycle of malicious data being recycled. And then also search engine manipulation. So through that, the bias programming and the malicious actors will also impact the search engine manipulation algorithms. Basically, will prioritize the distorted information based on the program, the bias programming. And then the bias programming and the malicious actors also yields to algorithmic bias, and the AI reflects the distortion and it magnifies it, and it's prejudicial training data essentially. And so, as I mentioned before, it's basically the marginalized, the disenfranchised becoming even more marginalized and disenfranchised as a result of this, right? So it's basically if you already had certain obstructions based on your race, color, imagine that being multiplied, 1,000, 1,000,000 times over as a result of that, right? How do you overcome that? Right? I mean, speaking out, asking for for things to be done differently in the industry, for new laws and regulations, basically that police and regulate AI and the data and how technology is being developed. But most importantly, prayer, right? Prayer. So, as we're navigating this, right? As I mentioned before, we're not just talking about stats, right? We're talking about systems. We're talking about a system. We're talking about disrupted system. We're talking about systems that try to silence. And so through the God-given authority, we have to disrupt them, right? We have to navigate the fog. This is where discernment becomes survival. I've seen, Christians, I've seen preachers, I've seen influencers make decisions or make comments based on distorted data. Not just my data, but just based on data. Things that are being spread, things that are going viral. And I think now more than ever, it's crucial to first rely on the Holy Spirit, rely on things that are offline first, and then second on things that are online, and then cross-checking that. I've seen prophetic words given to individuals that I'm like, that sounds like my scenario. That sounds like this is like God is speaking directly to me. I know, like, people would say that, that happens oftentimes, and, sometimes God may have a word for someone else and it's for you. But, like, there's been so many instances where that's happened because, unfortunately, my information is like has been disseminated all over the place. And so people are using my data to make information. People are using my data and they think that it pertains maybe to someone else and they're using it to give out prophecy. I've seen it. I've watched people give prophetic words and I'm like, okay, I know that this is based on information that was extracted from my system. Because look, I'm not against using technology. I'm not against using technology. I use technology. I think we need to keep up with the times, but we have to use our discernment and we have to be careful, right? As we're using the technology. I've been able to tell. I'm like, okay, this prophet, and I'm not saying that the person is a false prophet, and it's not just one prophet. I've seen it over, I've seen a few prophets do this. And I'm like, okay, they're using, I don't know what AI agent or AI tool they're using, but I'm like, or whatever, the analytics are feeding back to them. I'm like, okay, I can tell that they're using the analytics basically to come up with prophecy or to give someone like a prophetic word. And I think we have to be careful with that. I think we have to be very, very careful with that, because while I think it's good to a certain extent that, okay, you have more insight into whoever it is that you're talking to, potentially, right? Potentially. But, if that data is not that person's data and you're giving them a prophetic word based on the data that you think is their data, now you're misleading that person, and that person may be making a decision, a life altering decision based on that data. And so, yes, we always say test the spirit, but some people, they will just go off of whatever they hear because they know that, okay, this is a reputable prophet. I know that they mean well, and they'll just go off of that. And the prophet may also mean well, right? But they don't realize that they're being fed either distorted data, malicious data, or even data that they think pertains to this person does not pertain to them. Okay. I kind of went off on a tangent here, but this was something that I've observed, and I've been meaning to actually do either a short segment on it. I wanted to talk about it, and it just came up right now. Maybe, God wanted me to talk about it, or I just kind of went off on a tangent. But, I think, we have to use our discernment here. We have to use our discernment. We have to be careful with whatever data is being fed to us, and we have to cross-check it. And we can't just make decisions based on that. So I've learned, as a result, I've learned to listen differently. I've learned to research differently. I've learned to, whatever comes up in my feed, I have to cross-check it, even like I said, like I've seen people come on my feed and I'm like, okay, they're trolling. Or I've seen people, that say that they're targeted individuals and I'm like, okay, they're a plant. They're not really targeted. They have an incentive to do this or what have you. So, just different scenarios. And so we have to be very careful, right? We have to be very careful. And I'm not saying just to take my word as truth or what I'm saying is truth, right? Right? Just like I'm saying to be careful of what the algorithm is feeding you, yeah. But what I am saying is you don't have the full picture. You don't have the full picture. Whatever is being fed to you is distorted. It's painting a narrative, and I think a lot of people are just basically blindly using this information, and whether it's willingly, like I said, I've said this before, I think this is something that is, natural, technological, and spiritual. Some people are blinded spiritually, and so they are being manipulated into attacking, believing, whatever it is that they're seeing. And some people, they just, they like gossip. The first thing that they see is what they believe. Some people are thirsty for views, comments, for, to be popular. They're thirsty for money. And so if someone says, well, help us spread this misinformation, or instead of posting this on your podcast, post this, and then, we'll help you, we'll help you grow your podcast, or we'll pay you. I mean, I really suspect a lot of people are getting paid to spread this information, and whether people are actually approaching them, or because, the misinformation is doing well, right? And so let's spread, because, this is trending, so I'm going to post about it even though it's wrong. I'll post about it too because it's trending. And so, I've seen that in terms of trying to capitalize on a lie, right? Not just in my situation, but I've seen that with other people, well-known, people, especially within the Christian faith, right? But just in general, right? Whether it's just, a regular celebrity or what have you. So when the system is poisoned, clarity becomes warfare as well. And so we have to be very careful about that. So discernment is so important. I've had to ask myself, is this a coincidence or a coordinated delay? Is this person following me or monitoring me? Is this video that's popping up on my feed, is this like a planted video or not? Is this glitch random or reactive to my voice? So I've learned to basically listen differently, react differently, research differently, just basically move differently. And, I've documented patterns. I've documented a lot of things mentally because it's very exhaustive. Like, so much happens in my day-to-day life. Like, every minute, every second of my life is being monitored. It would be impossible for me to document everything. But like, I do take mental notes of certain things. And then if there is like a repeated pattern in like a certain instance, or things happening, I'll potentially document that. But, I've learned to trust my instincts. I've learned to pray. I've learned to rely on the Holy Spirit. I've learned to just take a pause on a lot of different things, before I publish, before I click on a video, just things in general, right? Information that I'm seeing, I've just learned to pause, because it's all designed to program us. And, I use the prophetic example because in my mind, right? And again, I said, I'm not calling these people false prophets, but in my mind, if a prophet, someone who's a seer, right? Someone who has more discernment than the average person, if they can be fooled, if they can be tricked by the algorithm, by the data, by the technology, how much more can the normal or average person be tricked, be programmed, be manipulated? How much more? We are in very serious times. And if we don't take back our control, we are in big trouble. We need to use discernment. We need to use discernment because when the system is poisoned, clarity becomes warfare. We need to take back the control. We need to take back the control. And so I've learned that even silence can be weaponized, right? So they loop old data to make it seem like I'm stuck, right? They'll exaggerate moments to paint me as unstable. They violate privacy in every category, whether it's personal, professional, spiritual, and then use that stolen insight to distort my image. But I'm not what they loop, right? I'm not what they label, and I'm what I live. I'm what I live. And, I just think we have to be very careful, very careful. And I'm just I'm nudging the prophetic voices, the prophets, the true prophets out there to be careful, and just to everyone, because if a prophet can be misguided, if a prophet can be, if they can be tricked, how much more can the average person? Because they have insight that we don't. They have insight that we don't. And so I've seen it. I'm like, okay, wow, this prophet is acting exactly as the algorithm was designed to make them react. They're saying exactly what the algorithm wants them to say. They're actually making a mistake in saying that this prophetic word is for this person. And I'm like, okay, I can tell that they're using something, to give this person a prophetic word. And it's, while I know that they're potentially also leaning on the Holy Spirit, but they're leaning on the technology also. And unfortunately, the technology is wrong. And so we need to be careful, ladies and gentlemen. We need to be careful. Now, fighting the flaw. So what do? We name it, we document it as much as possible, right? We speak it, we speak out. It's hard to document everything, as I mentioned before. We build platforms that can't be hijacked. I don't know if there are any targeted individuals who are tech experts. Reach out. If you're a cybersecurity expert, reach out. If you are a legislator, reach out. And let's just make things better. Let's do better. Let's do better. Judge Faith actually called out YouTube because of how her information was being distorted, and basically the misinformation was being spread and YouTube wasn't doing anything about it. And so, she fought back. She created content and she basically exposed the people that were spreading lies about her. And so we need to create content that can't be looped. And so we need to walk in truth that can't be silenced. And I think the more and more we speak our truth and we become the ones who are in charge of our narrative and we don't allow the technology to take control, I think we're in a better position. But from the looks of things and what I've been seeing, it seems like a lot of people have been allowing the technology to lead them as opposed to them leading the technology. And so we are not in a good position. Humanity is not in a good position. The spiritual leaders aren't in a good position because they're also being manipulated. The prophets, a lot of them have been manipulated by the technology as well. So we need to kind of tap into how things were done before technology while still using technology, right? And so we need to rely on our natural senses first and then on the technology. What I demand and what we all should demand is transparency, right? We need to have a diverse team or diverse teams building AI. We need to have audits of the training data that are being used. There needs to be oversight of surveillance tech. There needs to be accountability for digital harm. There needs to be more regulation around tech as a whole. I know that, as a country, we're trying to race to beat other countries with AI and things of that nature, but we can't forget ethics. We can't take ethics out of it just, because we're trying to be first, right? We need to do it right. We need to do it right. And we need to implement regulations and laws, statutes around how technology is being used, how data is being used. And so as Christians, we also need to reclaim our spiritual authority, because this isn't just about algorithms, right? As I mentioned, a lot of, the spiritual enemy that we have, they're using technology to obstruct us. They're using technology. As I said, they no longer need monitoring spirits spiritually, right? The technology has become their monitoring spirits. So it's about agency. It's about reclaiming your voice, your platform, and your presence. And we need to stay spiritually strong. We also need to be informed technologically, right? We need to be trained. We need to know how to use the most and the latest data, the latest technology, but at the same time, we need to be careful in what is being presented to us and how we're using it, because that same data, that same technology is also being used to program us. And if we're not careful, we're going to fall into what we don't actually want to fall into. And so as I close this episode, I want to say that, they tried to loop me, label me, silence me, obstruct me, but I'm still here and I'm still speaking. And so with that being said, I want to make this decree. I decree that every false flag, every poison algorithm, every surveillance tactic used against me shall be exposed, dismantled, and rendered powerless. I reclaim my voice, my platform, my presence, and I declare that no weapon formed against me shall prosper, and every tongue that rises up against me in judgment shall be condemned. I walk in divine clarity, digital sovereignty, and prophetic truth. My testimony will not be intercepted. My breakthrough will not be delayed. My identity will not be distorted. I am seen rightly, heard clearly, and covered completely. In Jesus' mighty name, amen, amen, amen. Taleo, taleo, taleo. Thanks for listening to the Dire-Rie of a Sane Black Woman. Once again, I'm your host, Marie. We're available on all major podcast platforms. Check out YouTube for the visual experience, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next episode.